I'm Greg Hunter. Welcome to USAWatchdog.com. With us, a professor of economics, professor of law at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, also a top regulator in the savings and loan debacle in the late 80s and cleaned up in the early 90s, where more than 1,000 people went to jail for that, which was much smaller than the debacle we had in the housing fraud that we had in the middle 2000s. And anyway, we have William Black, Professor William Black. Professor Black, thank you for joining us today on USAWatchdog.com.
Good to be back. Thanks.
Well, I just want to start and get your thoughts on the former Federal Reserve employee that stole documents, multiple documents, and gave them to his old boss at Goldman Sachs. And the old employee got a $2,000 fine, and the employee at Goldman Sachs, I think, got a $5,000 fine, and Goldman paid $50 million. Nobody went to jail. No felonies were initiated. What's going on with the financial system when this kind of stuff happens?
Well, there's one rule for everything else in life, and there's another rule for people who are elites in finance, but actually there's another rule for people who aren't even particularly elite in finance if they simply were with relatively elite financial institutions. And you've just seen it in action, or inaction.
The Goldman Sachs, they paid a $50 million fine and didn't admit to doing anything wrong, quote unquote. If they paid a $50 million fine, do you think that what they got from those behind-the-scenes Fed documents, somebody, I think Martin Armstrong was intimating that maybe they were rigging the Treasury market. Do you think maybe that they got riches far in excess of $50 million bucks?
Well, first, let's be clear that the Treasury markets have been rigged, and they were rigged by Solly, and back when there was a Salomon Brothers as an independent entity. And after they were caught rigging it, they rigged it again, which is why there is no independent Solly. So it's not crazy to think in terms of the Fed issuance markets being rigged. And indeed, at one point, Salomon Brothers had secretly was purchasing over 90% of the total issuance. Here, what's public is not necessarily as negative on Goldman Sachs. So this is, as you say, a former employee at the Fed in New York. And the Fed in New York, people have to understand, is more equal than all the other Feds and actually does the trading operations. So it is dangerous in those terms. It's something that should be governmental, but it isn't. It's this weird privatized world of the Fed that exercises the most public of responsibilities. Then you have a former employee of the Fed who used to be the guy at the Fed's boss, who's now at Goldman. We know that information gets leaked. We know that it's substantial information that gets leaked to Goldman. And we know that the Goldman guy tells his boss about it for obviously the purpose of trading secretly. We know that his boss at Goldman fails to take action, even though he knows that this is information that is illegally gotten to Goldman from inside the Fed. But his boss, so this is the third level at Goldman, does apparently, when he sees the information, say, hey, wait a minute, this is clearly improper, and blows the whistle through Goldman internal processes. So on what's public, Goldman at more senior levels may not in fact be dirty, may not have in fact used it, but at least two levels of Goldman were dirty in it, which is, dismaying. And of course, this Fed level, and it's an easy criminal case, absolutely easy.
Felony criminal case.
Felony criminal case where you're going to get prison time. No ifs, ands, or buts, and they deliberately don't get, they being the Department of Justice, deliberately don't get prison time. And that's, it would be inexplicable except for the fact that we are, of course, talking in 2016, and we have seen this time after time after time. And it is still true that of the people that actually led the three fraud epidemics, the most destructive fraud epidemics in history, financial fraud epidemics in history, 0 have been prosecuted, much less imprisoned.
Why do you think they're doing that? Why is this? Why do we have to live like this? I mean, we basically have an economy now with a criminal co-conspiratorship between the Justice Department, the government, and the banks. I mean, nobody goes to jail. They rig everything. Every market, all my guests here that have come on, I've come to the conclusion, I think a lot of my guests have said the same thing. Every market is rigged. LIBOR, Forex, gold, silver, housing, commodities, everything is rigged. Bond market, every market is rigged. How much longer can this go on, and how much longer can this go on?
Well, of course, these two are connected. If there are no serious penalties to the individual, if they rig the markets, then you make a ton of money by rigging markets, and the individuals get very wealthy. It isn't just that the individuals don't go to prison. They don't even have to give back the fraud proceeds, right? So you're talking about, in all of the things you talked about, and far broader than that. Those are big, but they're not as destructive as the fraud epidemics that actually caused the crisis, right? The appraisal fraud epidemic, the liar's loan epidemic, and then those are the two loan origination epidemics. There ain't no such thing as a fraud exorcist, so if you start out with fraudulent loans, you can only sell them to the secondary market. You can't say, hi, I want to sell you fraudulent loans. So your representations and warranties have to be fraudulent. And they were, and we know this. They were massively fraudulent. People are getting settlements that are in the $10 billion range. But not only do they not prosecute the officers who are made wealthy by leading these frauds, they don't make them give back any of their fraud proceeds. Look, I've been a government negotiator in these kinds of things. This is really easy. Here's the 4 CEO priorities when you're negotiating with them. 1, I don't go to jail. 2, I don't lose my job. 3, I don't have to repay any of my fraud proceeds. I get to keep them and stay wealthy. And 4, I don't throw anybody else in the executive chain to the wolves. Because if I did, maybe they would be, we call it flipping them. I'm also have a doctorate in criminology, and my field is elite white-collar crime and financial crises and financial regulation, right? So they don't want to throw the small guys to the wolves because we could, do a plea deal with them and get them to testify against the elite folks. And that's why, while the emphasis has been, hey, there's nobody in the C-suites going to prison, there's virtually nobody, period, if they work for a financial institution. You have to do something really stupid like get caught with coke in your pocket type of thing while committing some other felony to actually go to jail as a banker or sometimes insider fraud. But for the actual fraud schemes that drove the crisis, you simply will not go to prison. You will not be tried. It's not like they're losing the cases. They simply refuse to bring them. So in baseball metaphor, they strike out every time, but every time they are called out on strikes. They never even swing at a pitch.
And why are they doing this? This is fraud. This is government. This is a treasonous, because the Justice Department isn't doing their job. Why are they doing this?
Well, no one knows fully because it doesn't make any sense even in political terms, right? You could always sue the people you don't like in political terms or bring prosecutions against them, and assuredly there are a number of those folks that fall into that category. They started out from the beginning with 2 things that were disastrous. One, they did start out absolutely hostile to bringing prosecutions. And indeed, the president of the New York Fed has admitted that. He said, hey, we, at the beginning, we were just wanted to make sure that there weren't going to be prosecutions because the financial system was in such a fragile state. As I always say at this point, obviously financial regulators these days are much more sophisticated than we were 25 years ago because we had never figured out that leaving felons in charge of your largest financial institutions achieved financial stability. Who knew? What brilliance. And of course, as we've just been discussing, this is why you get the recidivism. So it isn't just that Bank of America and J.P. Morgan and Citi had committed 8 felonies. It's that while they've committed the 8 different kinds of felonies, and each of those typically is thousands to tens of thousands of actual felonies. So LIBOR is tens of thousands of illegal actions, right? Each of them a felony. But on top of that, while they're negotiating, they commit new felonies, and they still don't get prosecuted in any meaningful sense, and not a single individual does. There's been one civil case, one, in which a senior officer will actually have to dip into their own pockets and take out money. And of course, it's against a woman, right? A moderately senior person at Bank of America. But that's it, nationwide.
And you're involved in I know you're an expert on all this stuff. You're actually involved in some of the negotiations going on for these goofy fines for LIBOR and...
No. I'm saying decades ago.
Okay, so you understand all the negotiations all going on and
right.
all the... Yeah, I got that. Okay.
Incredibly easy to get one of these settlements is my point. Because the CEO controls the bank. And so the CEO can simply trade off money from the bank, not from him, from the bank, and get a deal in which they achieve all 4 of their top priorities. Again, I don't go to prison, I don't lose my job, I don't have to repay the fraud proceeds, and I don't send anybody else down the road who could be flipped. Now, the other thing that's been done, people simply do not understand how important what I'm about to say is, because it doesn't fit their conspiracy theory type stuff. But they destroyed, actually under the Bush administration, but it's continued under the Obama administration, the criminal referral process. Well, here are the key things people don't get about prosecuting elite white-collar crime. We have nationwide 2,000 FBI agents that do elite white-collar crime investigations. We have slightly over 1,000 industries in the United States, not corporation, industries. So we got right around 2 FBI agents per industry. Now that means, first, it's not going to work. We don't have remotely enough resources. But second, it means that they can't possibly, the FBI agents, have expertise in any particular industry. Literally a handful will have expertise in any individual industry. And third, it means they can't walk a beat, or they would never find anything. So they only come when there's a criminal referral. Next key fact, banks or other corporations don't make criminal referrals against their own CEOs. Shocking, I know. So the only way you're going to get a criminal referral, which is the only way you're going to get a meaningful investigation, is if the agency makes the criminal referral, or every once in a while, a whistleblower who has access to the C-suites. But that's going to be rare, right? So when you destroy the criminal referral process, none of this work happens. Instead, you get...
And they did that on purpose, you think?
Clearly they did it on purpose. You don't have to, again, think massive conspiracy. It's possible they were just idiots. And, it had been a quiet period in failures. So they figure, why do we use, and people forget, and this is mostly Clinton, but continued by Bush, the FDIC lost more than 3/4 of its personnel leading up to this crisis. The Office of Thrift Supervision, which was supposed to regulate savings and loans like Countrywide, Washington Mutual, IndyMac, lost over half of its personnel, right? So these places were gutted deliberately to save money, even though it's kind of more expensive not to regulate banks. And that means you got very few folks left. The Justice Department isn't prosecuting hardly anyone. So why do you have experienced people being criminal referral coordinators? They got rid of them. Here's the other thing people don't get. 9/11 hits. We used to have 2,500 FBI agents that did white collar. They transferred 500 of them to national security. They made priorities 1 through 9 at the FBI national security. The 10th priority is everything else, and within the 10th priority, depending on the year, finance, these elite financial things are 6 or 7. Okay, so these are really low priority for the FBI. But on top of that, if you're going to transfer white-collar folks, why are you transferring them to national security? What's the skill set? The answer to that is you want the people who are best at following the money, is our phrase, right? Because we can't infiltrate Al-Qaeda, but we can follow cash flows, and that can tell us important intelligence. Well, if I'm transferring these folks to my ultimate priority, am I going to take my best folks or my worst folks?
Best.
Your absolute best in precisely the skill category, financial analysis, that we most need to do elite white-collar crimes. If you lose 20%, 1 out of 5 of your people, and they are the best 500 out of your 2,500, do you lose 20% of your effectiveness? No, you lose more like 50% of your effectiveness, right? When you take your top people out of an organization. So they are been set up to fail through a combination of things. And then there's the obvious, right? Finance is typically the leading source of political contributions and lobbying.
Which is why Bernie Sanders is doing well.
Which is why people like Bernie Sanders are doing well. Because, and it's why what Senator Warren says is just right? So to put them together, the system is rigged, as you said.
Well, that's why when Trump comes out and says, I'm funding my own campaign. That's why he's doing well, because I don't need their money.
That's certainly part of it.
You may or may not like him. You may not like Bernie Sanders. You may or may not like, Trump. But there's a reason why Bernie Sanders just creamed Hillary Clinton in, Hawaii, Alaska, and Oregon or Washington State?
Washington State.
Yeah, she creamed her. Creamed her.
Right. So people agree. People on Wall Street agree that the system is rigged. You get them into a bar, they will say the same thing. When Bernie Sanders says, that the business plan of Wall Street is fraud, that's simply an accurate, objective fact, right? That is their key profit center. And it's not just here.
Wait, stop. Fraud is the key profit center of Wall Street.
Yeah. And it's not just here. The United States has been in a competition with the United Kingdom for decades now on this race to the bottom with the City of London and Wall Street. And so the UK parliamentary inquiry, which is run by the Tories, right? Not a party exactly hostile to finance historically or today. Well, the Tories, in their UK parliamentary inquiry, found as a fact that the leading source of profits, indeed, and I mean leading doesn't quite do it. They said that all of the profits, retail profits, of the largest banks in the United Kingdom came from the deliberate, now they use a euphemism, mis-selling a product
Fraud.
to customers. Right. So this is stuff where if you came in for any kind of loan, they would sell you an insurance product as well. Insurance product was about whether you lost your job, right? Then they would immediately turn around and resell that insurance product to an insurance company. And they would get, you'll understand this, for every $1, they would get 78 cents immediately as a commission. That's how immensely overpriced this crap was. It should literally never have been sold to a single person. And by the way, they had a special different product, a derivative, a complex derivative that they sold to rip off small business people, the entrepreneurs, right? This is banks who tell you that their thing in life is we support entrepreneurs and make the economy go. No, they deliberately ripped off the entrepreneurs. They deliberately ripped off their customers, and the Tories found it represented all of their retail profits came from this. And we're not talking tiny numbers. We're talking 50 billion pounds. And for most of this time period, the pound was considerably, higher than the dollar. So you're talking more in the range of $80 billion.
Well, so you painted this picture of we basically have a fraudulent system, a financial system. Basically, we do, and not even basically, we have a fraudulent financial system. Is that correct?
Yeah, because
a system based on fraud.
For all the reasons we've gone through. It's hard to make money through competition. It's really hard, right? People who have never been in business don't understand how hard real competition is to prosper. But if you rig the system, it's really easy. And the rewards are phenomenal. We're talking every year hundreds of billions of dollars in compensation, bonus compensation, far more than their straight salaries, going to folks that wouldn't go to them if they didn't rig the system.
So if the system's based on
and no
fraud,
one's prosecuted.
No, that's right. Nobody's prosecuted. And nobody's prosecuted, yes. Fraud, system is fraudulent, nobody's prosecuted. So it's a government co-conspiracy.
And they don't even get back the fraud proceeds even when they catch you red-handed.
And to my next question, the financial stability of the system, this just has to be extremely destabilizing. I mean, you were on the cutting edge back in the savings and loan crisis. You saw what massive fraud did. It imploded the housing market. I mean, it's going on today. A friend of mine sold a house. He sold it for $5,000 more than what he wanted for it. He gave back the $5,000 at closing, and it was a no money down, purchase, which is why the housing market it's based on fraud. At long and short of it is, if this system is based on fraud, as you have clearly illustrated, if it's based on fraud, isn't it bound to destabilize and implode?
Well, that was, of course, the purpose of my joke about we had never figured out that keeping fraudulent people in power was a means of keeping a system stable. Obviously, it's the worst possible thing to do in terms of stability. You are quite correct that the way in which you rig these things doesn't just make you wealthy. It creates asset bubbles, massive asset bubbles, the biggest in history. And it didn't just in the United States.
And that's what's going on right now. The biggest asset bubble in history.
No, that's what went on in the lead up to this crisis. If there are massive asset bubbles right now, they're more likely to be in China. And that's quite possibly true. But all the numbers, you have to remember, all the numbers from China are lies. Right? So, because every official has an incentive to lie about the numbers. So it's very difficult to know what's actually happening in China. And what we try to do to make our best estimates is actually look at things like, can we tell how much steel they're really consuming and how much is going into surplus? And does that actually, we call it in accounting, do those numbers foot? Do they make sense to each other? And frequently they don't in China.
But back to the financial system at large. It is this massive amount of unpunished fraud, which is their primary way they make money. I mean, this is stunning to me that you're saying that the number one way the financial system makes money in America and in Great Britain and many other places, I guess, is to commit fraud. Tell me about how it can destabilize the financial system.
Well, let's go back to, we tend as Americans to think only in terms of America, but Ireland's real estate bubble was, as relative to GDP, twice as large as that of the United States. Spain's was 1.8 times. In Iceland, the three largest banks had 10 times the liabilities as the GDP of Iceland. And they were growing at 50% a year, which is to say that means with compounding, you double in size about every 9 months. So as I say, thank God for Lehman, for Dick Folds' avaricious heart, bringing Lehman down quickly enough. Can you imagine if we'd allowed the bubble to expand another 2 years in the United States? How horrific the damage. There would have been, if it had taken another 2 years, there would be no Ireland. There would be no Iceland. I mean, there would be islands, but they wouldn't have people because your deaths load would have been just, pick your astronomical cliche, and people would have left those countries. They would have been left with retirees only. So these were actually crises that have you've seen the EU is now riven. And yes, of course, part of it is the refugees. But even without that, the southern tier, so I'm talking about Spain, Italy, and Greece, collectively, they have 100 million population. Roughly 1/3 the total population of the Eurozone. It's 2016. These nations, each of these three nations, continue to have Great Depression levels of unemployment today, right? And have had since the crisis. So this crisis really deserves the name Great Recession. In the United States, the estimated lost GDP over the course of the Great Recession is $24.3 trillion by economists, right? A trillion is 1,000 billion. 9.3 million Americans lost their jobs. Another 5 million jobs that normally would have been created were not created. Latino college-educated households, the median loss of wealth is over 60%. Black college-educated households, the median loss of wealth is 55%. This has been a catastrophe for the world, much of the world. We are so wealthy as a nation that we're still, you can look around the world, the nation, you still see enormous wealth. But big chunks of Americans who did everything right, who went to college, saved, tried to buy the home and such, followed the advice we all got, which was to buy early, right? Buy your house early and such. They have been wiped out. And they will be wiped out for at least a generation to come.
Are you worried about another financial calamity? I mean, a lot of things going on in the derivative market. The derivative market is huge. I mean, some of the banks have tried to vent it off. But the derivative market globally in the United States is a couple $100 trillion the banks have in the derivative market exposure. There's the unemployment rate is a 29-hour-a-week jobs. The labor participation rate is 94 million. There's
labor
a lot of warning signs
participation
out there. Are you worried about this turning into another calamity with all this fraud?
Yes, you always worry about it because you don't know how big a problem they cause. But my best view is it won't be till we crank up again and really boost that labor participation rate and elsewhere. And have a number of years of very fast growth, 5% type growth, that we will have the next massive bubbles.
So you don't think there's any calamity coming down the pipe? Charles Nenner he said that the thing would blow up before sometime in 2017. Other people think that we'll have major trouble because of the AIIB and that they're starting. All these countries are flocking to the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and they're worried about the dollars of reserve currency, and they're worried about all the debt. What say you about all those possibilities for calamity this year and or next year?
Okay, so first, none of us have the ability to predict accurately when a collapse is going to come. So I would be very skeptical of anyone who purports to put a date on it. They'll be right occasionally, but most of the time they'll just ignore the fact that it didn't happen when they predicted. I'm telling you about probabilities. It's much more probable that you will have a really big collapse when you have a really big bubble. We don't have a massive bubble in the United States. You are correct about derivatives. Not only is the number massive, but it's 95% of that number is in only 6 banks in the United States. So that's a separate but critical issue. We don't even have the honesty as a system, and I mean globally, to call these things by the right name. By definition, these are systemically dangerous institutions, SDIs. But we call them systemically important, like they deserve the gold star. They're not important. They don't help the world. They are purely in this category. And even the Fed says this on websites, for example, at St. Louis. The Fed St. Louis says the way you get on this list is because you're so big that when you fail, you are likely to cause a global crisis. And notice I used the word when, not if, right? So we have roughly 25 of these systemically dangerous institutions in the United States, ballpark around 35 globally on top of that. So we roll the dice just in the United States 25 times every day to see, when the next one will blow up.
The fraud makes things fragile.
The fraud does make things very fragile for the reasons that we've talked about, and it means not only that it's fragile, but people are quite willing to go out and do things that are economically insane for the institution, but very good for them.
How do we stop this? How do we stop this? I mean, I look at this every week, and this is just fraud. I mean, I feel like I'm just blowing smoke into the wind. I mean, I report on this all the time. I report on this thing with the Fed and taking documents to Goldman and getting a $2,000 fine. How do we stop this?
Okay, so give me 2 answers. One is the pragmatic, if people have the will, and the second one is the question of will. As to the first, I'm part of a founding member of the group Bank Whistleblowers United. So this is the leading whistleblower at Citigroup, the leading whistleblower at Bank of America, a leading whistleblower at the Securities and Exchange Commission, and I'm a serial whistleblower from the old days. And so we got a detailed plan of how to do several things. One is to restore the rule of law. And we're practical types. So we've created this in ways that require no new legislation and no new regulation. So there's no excuse, I don't control the House or the Senate. I was just elected president. Any president could do this, and we make it available, of course, free to all candidates, and of course President Obama. Why doesn't he do it now is our pitch with regard to President Obama. Second part, we get rid of the systemically dangerous institutions, using the authority we've had for 25 years to set individual minimum capital requirements. The third would bring back the beneficial parts of Glass-Steagall to the same individual minimum capital requirements. The fourth is one that you've talked about. We asked them all to take a pledge that comes out of my experience in the savings and loan debacle. As litigation director, when we would bring our cases, we would, unlike the Justice Department, of course, go after the top people by name and seek recovery from them, from their assets. And we would set out the fraud in plain English that people could understand, very graphic. Justice Department doesn't do any of those things, of course, today. But what happened after a while is that politicians then rushed to give back their political contributions that they had taken from these entities where we had laid out the detailed fraud scheme and, all kinds of gory inside quotations from their documents and such. Of course, the Justice Department does none of that today, but today politicians feel no need to give back money even from the felons. So we call on all of the candidates to take a pledge that they won't take money from financial institutions where the government has identified them as fraudulent enterprises.
You're telling me that Hillary Clinton and anybody else taking money from these banks is basically taking fraud money?
Yeah. Again, their primary source of profits has been for over a decade, has been fraud. So that's basically how we phrase it. Stop taking money from the financial felons.
And you're Bank Whistleblower, what is it again?
Bank Whistleblowers United.
Bank Whistleblowers United. Is that on your website? Do you have a website?
Well, we're trying to create that. We have no budget, of course, but we're going to... Right now, you can find the documents on the UMKC economics blog, which is called New Economic Perspectives.
NewEconomicPerspectivesblog.com or .org?
.com.
NewEconomicPerspectives.com.
Right. If they look under, just use their search engine for New Economic Perspectives, all will go well. And then use our search within it to look for Bank Whistleblowers United. But we will have a separate website soon.
Do you have a website, William K. Black, that we could point people to?
No, I use New Economic Perspectives.
NewEconomicPerspectives.com.
Yeah, I'm the editor of our blog site, right?
I will link to that. I will link to that just so people know. I'll link to NewEconomicPerspectives.com. William K. Black, you are a gem. I mean, it's very depressing what you're saying, but if You're saying what I've been saying, and I've been saying it not as forcefully and as educatedly as you, that we just have a lot of fraud. You're saying it's all fraud. But thank you.
It's not all fraud, but it is the business strategy.
Fraud.
Yeah.
Oh, boy. William, Professor Black, thank you for joining us today on USAWatchdog.com.
Thank you. Take care.